This is an interview with State Senator Thomas Allgood on January 25th. I usually start out by asking people sort of something about your background, where you grew up, and early exposure to politics, early influences, and so forth. So why don't we start from there?
Well, I was born in Augusta, Georgia, and my father became a police officer in Augusta the year I was born, 1928. And as a young man, as a young boy, I had an opportunity to travel a lot with him in the carrying out of his duties. Probably when I was about 8 or 9 years old, he became what we called sort of the liquor, the illegal liquor, but we called it the liquor department. What he really worked on was bootleg alcohol, bootleg whiskey. And of course he wore civilian clothes and had an unmarked car and worked very closely with the state revenue agents and some of the federal agents too, alcohol and tobacco units. So that was my first experience around him. I was in courthouses since I can remember when he would appear in court, sometimes on Saturdays, sometimes in the afternoons and evenings. I would just ride with him, and that goes back to my earliest memories. I just had a father that took me everywhere with him. So I came to admire the law enforcement officers, and I saw the court proceedings, but my contacts were with law enforcement, and I was tempted to go into that, but somehow or another I managed to get to Emory Law School after I had served a stint in the Army as a very young soldier. When I was 17, I went in and then went to Japan. But when I came back, I started school, went to law school at Emory, graduated. I came within just a fraction of becoming an FBI agent. My father, of course, wanted me to be, and in view of my early contacts, I sort of wanted to be too. So I was 22 years old at the time, and you had to be 25 in order to be an FBI agent. So it took an order from J. Edgar Hoover to make any exception, but somehow or another he made the exception, and I went to Savannah and took the test, and I was going to become an FBI agent. One Saturday morning I was home from school and was in my father's offices at police headquarters, and I was talking to some of the agents. And I had on my best outfit, a sport coat and some slacks and a pair of Argyle socks, which was the fashion then. This is 1952. And they told me, and they said, well, you might as well adjust to it. You'll get rid of those Argyles and that sport coats, because as an FBI agent you will wear a uniform. And I said, what kind of uniform? And they told me, well, you either wore a navy blue suit or a gray flannel suit, and you wore a hat at all times. And at that time I had a large head of hair, and I had never worn a hat, and I got to thinking about that, and I told my father later in the morning as we were walking out that I wasn't sure that I wanted to be an FBI agent. And that very same afternoon I rented a law office on the spur of the moment, and I decided that I would practice law. So I never held another job. I went out on my own, didn't work with any other law firm, and so since that time I've been on my own.
It's a wild story. When I interviewed this speaker, he mentioned that he toyed with the idea of being a GBI agent, sort of after coming back from the service and so forth.
Well, you know, that was quite a glamorous undertaking, and also a very well-paying job. I think in 1952, a starting agent made an income of around $10,000 a year. And that was the goal of a lot of people, to make $10,000 a year. That was an incredible amount of money. So being an agent was very attractive. I didn't particularly like the thought of traveling the world, never knowing where I would be, but on the other hand, that was fascinating too. I guess more than anything else, the thing that prevented me being an agent or a law enforcement officer was simply that I knew that I wasn't a conformist to the extent that I would wear a hat or that I would wear the same color suit every day as a matter of my job. I didn't have any choice. And they made no bones about it. That's what I would wear. And he made no bones about the fact that generally the agency at that time would send me to another part of the country, even with the fact that I had a noticeable Southern accent. I would be doing routine work anywhere, New York, California. It still had its glamour, but I'm glad I didn't do it.
Right. Now, growing up in Augusta in the 40s, do you have any recollections of Roy Harris or the Cracker Party or any of those events, individuals in the 40s?
Sure, the police department was totally dominated by the Cracker Party. And in order to get ahead, even as a police officer or fireman, you had to be on the inside. We had a public safety commissioner. His name was John Murray, or John Kennedy. And he had a political situation, whereas public safety, he was head of both the fire and police department. And in order to get elected to anything, or to even rise as a salaried employee of the fire department or police department, you had to have political standing. Roy Harris was in the inner circles of the Cracker Party locally and in the inner circle of state politics. We all knew Roy Harris and knew that to get anything done, you had to have the blessings of Roy Harris and John Kennedy. My father, for many years, was sort of on the outside of that group, and he remained just a walking policeman for a long time. And then in the middle 40s, in a real upset, the Cracker Party was defeated at the polls, and a new group came in. I can't remember the name of the group right now. I'll think of it in just a minute. But they dominated politics for the next 10 to 15 years in Augusta and Richmond County. And Mr. Harris was sort of on the outside, although he had a great deal of influence still. He was not in the power situation that he'd been earlier.
Well, he lost his seat, right?
He did, yes. He sure did. And he sort of then became what many referred to as a kingmaker rather than a king. He is credited with making several governors. Ellis Arnold, then he fell out with Ellis, and he is credited with electing Marvin Griffith, and although he early on, I believe, had supported one of the other candidates in that particular situation.
Tom Linder before?
Either that or Ed Rivers. No, I believe he really disliked Ed Rivers, but at one time or another, Roy Harris was identified with every named candidate for governor, and no matter even if his candidate lost, he always seemed to come out on his feet as a political person.
And you had observations of him as a young man?
Yes, I knew him, and I didn't, at that point I had made up my mind that I never wanted to be in politics. And therefore, when I entered the law practice, I developed a specialized type of practice that clearly avoided politics, and we were what we call insurance defense lawyers. I had a little background while in law school of working for insurance companies, so I became that type of lawyer. And over the years we were successful, and I didn't do any criminal work. I didn't do any work except that type. And that way I stayed out of politics until, 1976, when I decided to run for the Senate. And at that time I'd been practicing law 23 years. I was still pretty young, but I'd been there a long time.
There was some episode that I read about, I believe when you were in law school and attended a Herman Talmadge rally.
That's right. I'd forgotten that. A group of us at law school, we chartered a bus and went down to the opening of Herman Talmadge's campaign for governor. I believe it was 1950, and I believe it was at Radium Springs in Albany. And although I had been around politics and politicians and been around black people all my life, particularly because my father would take me into black areas. And I was well aware of segregation. I had never seen it in its rawest form until I went to Herman Talmadge's campaign opening. The black people were totally segregated at that political rally. They were treated with utter contempt. Talmadge's references to them as niggers was repeated. His campaign rhetoric was strictly racial. His supporters there were applauding wildly when he would talk about the niggers, and yet there were literally 100 of them there or more doing all the cooking, all the preparation, serving. And I couldn't help but wonder, how do these people feel about this? I mean, they just ignored everything he was saying, as if, he wasn't talking about them. It was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. The whites didn't seem to be aware that Herman Talmadge was talking about those black people there, and those black people didn't seem to realize that he meant it, that he was calling them really just almost worthless human beings, and that he would keep them from any opportunities for education in Georgia. He would keep them in their present position if he were elected governor. Nobody seemed to realize what he was saying. I did. And I thought to myself, this is really disgusting. This man is an unkind, cruel human being. And these poor people are so suppressed that either they do not realize what he's saying, or they are so afraid to indicate even the slightest feeling for fear that they will literally be dragged out of there and punished. And I think they would have been. I truly believe, had one of them said a single word or indicated any objection to what Herman Talmadge was saying, they would have taken him over there, and there's no telling what they would have done. That's when I really I knew that system was wrong. I knew it was sickening. Yet I didn't have the strength or courage to become an out-and-out crusader. I wanted to be a successful lawyer, and I knew I had to live within the framework of everything I had grown up in. And so for a while, all I did was take their cases for black people. And I fought in the civil courts. You had a lot of lawyers that represented them in criminal cases, but you had none that were willing to fight the white establishment to bring suits against doctors, against the railroads, against the business interest for the blacks. I probably was one of the first who did that. And that was different from what the other lawyers were doing. Yeah, you had civil rights lawyers out there all the time, but you didn't have any that were protecting their financial rights, and frequently they were just being run over.
The question I had was more whether that incident had any impact in you getting away from politics.
Yes, it did, and because I knew that I could not enter politics with the same or any approach similar to that expressed by Talmadge and the whites of that era, 1952. I could not. And therefore, if I was going to be a lawyer and to have any financial success, which was important to me at the time, then what I had to do was just stay out of politics and practice law, and I did it that way.
Your partner, though, Mr. Childs, had been involved in politics. Is that at the county level? Is that right?
Yes, he became involved, though probably, I would just say, about 1970. Neither one of us had any political activity whatsoever during the 50s or the 60s, except in the area I'm talking about. I was trying in 1966 medical malpractice cases for black plaintiffs against white doctors. Still not very popular. It wasn't popular back then. But we were, Alan Childs became on the Democratic Executive Committee and then became chairman of it within a short time, I'd say the early 70s, and has remained chairman of it except for a brief period when he resigned. He's chairman now. So he was involved at that level, but we didn't go to political rallies. I didn't. We never sought any political office until I ran for the Senate.
Then what prompted you in 1976 or 75, whenever you...
Well, I had decided in 1972 that I wanted to do something other than be a trial lawyer. I'd been at that then 20 years, and I had tried a lot of cases. I was living in South Carolina at the time, just across the river, simply because I had gone through a divorce. I could live wherever I wanted to. I had an opportunity to do a lot of my type of work in South Carolina, because all we do is cross the river, of course. So I moved over there and became a member of the South Carolina Bar. You could become a member at that time through a lot of devious means, but the law was that you had to be a legal resident for 1 year, and you had to be a graduate of an accredited law school. So I was a graduate of an accredited law school. Being divorced at the time, I moved to South Carolina. And so I became a member of the bar there, and I lived there till 72, and in 72 I began to think, well, Georgia's my home. At some point in time I probably would like to try for a political office, and perhaps it was time for me, so I moved back to Georgia in 72. Then the first office that really became available, in which I was interested, but by being available I mean that the incumbent person decided not to run, was when Senator Hawley decided not to seek re-election in 1976. So I decided that was what I would do.
And what were his reasons for not seeking re-election at that time? And that was before he was indicted.
Yeah, well, he was very heavily involved in international business. He was dealing in hundreds of millions of dollars. He had oil interests in the Middle East. He traveled worldwide extensively, and at that time we were unaware, those of us in Augusta were unaware of any problems he had in the banking. And I still believe, if you ever really looked into it, that a great many of Gene Hawley's problems arose out of the fact that he had some strong differences of opinion with Jimmy Carter, and Carter was determined to get to Culver Kidd and his allies, and Gene Hawley was one of them. And this would be a fascinating story to me if you ever really looked into it, what went on then, because it's my understanding and my impression at least that when Carter became president, that he threw all the might of the United States government against Culver Kidd and Gene Hawley. And I do know a little bit about the Gene Hawley case, and my impression is that there is some credence to the stories about the federal government being the ones who really set out to destroy Gene Hawley. Now, they convicted Gene Hawley really on bank fraud, and my limited knowledge of the facts indicate that they truly had a very weak case of fraud, maybe mismanagement and some things of that type.
Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Well, they made some bad loans, and the bad loans were not necessarily illegally made. They just turned out to be bad. But when you had the downturn in the economy about that time, and if you hadn't had a whole lot of circumstances like the oil situation in the Middle East took a turn against Gene Hawley. And all these things combined, there's no question but what business-wise, Gene Hawley's collapse caused a lot of people to lose some money. Now, had he been just the situation a little bit luckier, the timing a little bit differently, Gene could have been one of the world's largest financiers today. He could be an international business figure. But timing and circumstances, caught him.
Again, I was also interested in Jimmy Carter's involvement. Of course, I know about the battles during the time that he was governor, but what leads you to say that you think that he might have been involved in some way?
Well, the federal government prosecuted Culver Kid.
Right, and Carter testified from the White House.
And Carter could have stopped it, or he could have initiated it. I believe he initiated it. I don't believe that, from what I know of the case that they had against Culver Kid, it was ridiculous. And as it turned out, a jury gave very little time to considering the charges against Culver. But I believe that, from what I know of it, that Jimmy Carter played a great hand in it and could have prevented that. He could have prevented it in Gene Holly's situation. Or he could have initiated it. And perhaps if he didn't initiate it, he knew it was going on. And I'm certain it wouldn't have gone on without at least his tacit consent. And yes, Gene Holly was convicted. But at that time, and under those circumstances, as I say, it could have, a jury looking at just all the evidence could just say, all right, these people have lost their money. Some of these papers are not exactly right the way they should be. And instead of saying there's a civil wrongdoing, they said, well, he's charged with a crime. They don't know the difference between civil and criminal. Well, he did something he wasn't supposed to do, so it's a crime. And that's exactly what the U.S. attorney would have argued. That this is wrong, and he could prove something was wrong. But having been a trial lawyer most of my life, I can tell you that juries are unable to distinguish between civil and criminal wrongdoing. If it's wrong, it's wrong, and therefore whatever he's being tried for, if he was being in civil court, they would award damages. If he's in criminal court, they're going to convict him.
Right.
And it's not the way it's supposed to be, but it unfortunately is. Yeah.
Let's go back to that first campaign. Maybe what memories do you have of that initial campaign in 1976?
Well, very difficult for me. I had always had a protected environment. For example, in a courtroom, I knew exactly what the rules were. I like to consider myself an expert on those rules. I knew what I could do, and I used it to the fullest extent. I knew what the other lawyers couldn't do, and I limited them. And most lawyers who came into court did not have that knowledge or expertise. Then I had to stand up in front of 12 people, generally. Sometimes we'd have 6-person juries even then, but by far and away most of them were 12. I knew those 12 people had to sit there and listen to me. I knew that they couldn't say anything, they couldn't do anything. Now, when I left that environment and went out to speak publicly for the first time, it's a totally different situation. There are no controls. There is no protected environment. You're out there where you don't have anyone to bang a gavel at the other side or to yell at you. So you learn completely different tactics. You learn to individually take control of that situation. That's the key to being a successful public speaker or a successful politician. I don't mean to suggest that I was able to do it, because as a matter of fact, I don't think I was. I don't think that's exactly my cup of tea. I might have, with a lot of hard work and study, become fairly good at it. But on a campaign at the level of state senator, you don't do that. If you were in a campaign for governor or state senate or something like that, then you would have to become, as Ronald Reagan did, the great communicator, and have the ability to dominate even huge crowds. But I did learn how to take control of public meetings, or hopefully to influence them, to have a presence, to enter in a way, or to be there in a way where I could use the force of my personality to make people listen to me, to say things that in a way that would appeal to them. The substance of what you were saying was not nearly as important as whether or not it would appeal. And sometimes there was an awful lot of rhetoric there, and very little substance. But that's true of political speech making. All that I've seen, and having just listened to the presidential campaign all summer and most of the fall, there was more rhetoric than it was substance. And both candidates were quite good at it. I think Bush did what he had to do. It wasn't very nice, but the Democrats, his opponent in particular, challenged him to fight. They told him that, they liked him being the wimp, and he came out fighting, and the others backed up and never took up the challenge. They should have made it a fight. They threw the gauntlet down, and when the man came across, he beat him. But even at a senatorial campaign like mine, you either throw the gauntlet down, or if you're on the other side, you go across it. And then if you do, you have to learn how to fight under those circumstances. And it literally, I think the word fight is a fair word. That's what it is.
Okay. Just how does that word relate to, say, your first campaign, or any subsequent campaign for that matter?
In my first campaign, I had two people that I had known many years running against me. Both had a long political background. Both had been successful. And I'd have to say that to some extent my two opponents were friends.
And that's Matthew Mulherin.
Matthew Mulherin and Norman Simowitz.
Right.
Well, in the primary, I had 49 point some odd percent of the overall vote, but then I had to have a runoff because I didn't have the 51%. I think that I needed about 20 some odd votes to avoid a runoff. It was not a bitter campaign. It was really a rather easy campaign. Then the only other campaign I've had was in 1988. It was a bitter campaign. It was racial. I did not make it that way. My opponent did. I decided in the beginning that I would run a very high-type campaign, avoid racism. I will never do that again against him, or against a black candidate. If it becomes racist, I will make it racist, or I will participate in that, simply because of this. What I saw in 1950 at Radium Springs was wrong. The whites were engaged in flagrant racism. Now the blacks are engaged in flagrant racism. Regardless of what they tell you, my opponent and others have argued, you should vote for me because I am black. That's what they argue. And that's wrong. And it's just as wrong as a white candidate saying to those, vote for me because I'm white. Eventually, the blacks will lose this because there are more whites than there are blacks. And I see at this point in time that the white community has changed its view and is now beginning to say enough is enough. We wish to be, we have put aside the old ways of the South, and it's not limited to the South, I don't mean to suggest that, but whites have become quite ready and willing to deal with people in life, regardless of race or religion or other things. More and more people have done that. But blacks have reverted and now do exactly what whites were doing, and with as much viciousness almost as we had in the South in Reconstruction days.
And this last campaign, of course, you had known your rival for years and years.
Known him and supported him and helped him secure his civil rights. I didn't ever think he would run against me. Have helped him financially over the years. And so I really thought that he would run a high-type campaign. He did not, but he didn't have anything to say against me except basically he called me racist, and that he said he ought to win because he was black and that district ought to have a black regardless of his qualifications. That's basically what he's arguing.
Is your district now majority black? Or
It's about 50-50.
It's about 50-50, that's what I thought.
It's as close as you can get, really, to 50-50.
Mm-hmm. And I guess you had one other black opponent at one time.
Yeah, I did. That was in '84.
Yeah.
Of the two candidates that have run against me, the blacks, Ed McIntyre in '88, A.K. Hassan in '84, to tell you the truth, A.K. Hassan is by far and away the better candidate. He's an intelligent person, articulate. He, if he is racist, it doesn't show as blatantly as it does with Ed McIntyre. And I think Hassan was a person who really would try to use public office for the benefit of the people. We know that Ed McIntyre is for Ed McIntyre, and that's really all. McIntyre still has a lot of ambitions, and I fully intend henceforth to challenge McIntyre at any and every opportunity. He is not in the best interest of our community. He is not in the best interest of blacks. He never has been. When he held high public office, he only used it for personal gain. He never used it for the benefit of the blacks. I have done far more in politics for blacks than Ed McIntyre ever thought about doing. And have fought more causes for them than him. He just deals in racism, and that's all.
Coming on board here in '77, then, who were some of the people who showed you the ropes, provided guidance, looked towards leadership?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. We had a substantial turnover in the Georgia Senate in '76 from the elections of '75, due in a large part to the Nixon situation, the honesty and credibility in government things. I've forgotten how many senators had changed in the '75 election, but more and more people were looking for honesty and integrity. Of course, that's why Jimmy Carter was elected president. In my view, people felt like that Jimmy Carter is a very fine Christian, honest man, and I have to say he seems to be. And that's what people wanted more in a political person than any other. I think that helped me in my election because of my father and my grandfather in Augusta and myself. My family, if we didn't have any other credentials, we had credentials for being people of honor and integrity and character.
Was your grandfather also on the police force?
No, my grandfather was a farmer, but he was not well known in Augusta. And both sides of my family. My mother's family was well known in that area too. And they had been there for generations. And way back in my history, John Allgood served with Washington at Valley Forge, and you can trace our family directly from him to our area, and they've been right outside of Augusta all those years. But anyway, going back to '77, when I came here, there had been a significant turnover 2 years before. The year that I came, 12 new senators came. And so there were a lot of inexperienced, fairly young people there. I was a little older than most of them. And from that group, I was sort of able to, because of being a trial lawyer, having been a trial lawyer and everything, I sort of helped a lot of them write their bills. Then I found that Hugh Gillis was a good friend. Joe Kennedy was a good friend, and Terrell Starr. Those three probably helped me more than anything because they came to use me for technical legal things, and within a few months after being in the Senate, I was inundated with senators bringing me bills, asking me to rewrite them or help them with it. So,
including such veterans.
That's right, ones that had been here many years. And so I became a bill writer, which I enjoyed very much because I could write amendments very quickly. I'd done this all my life, well, not say all my life, from the time I started
20
life,
years, yeah.
the law school, I knew how to write, knew how to take something quickly and amend a bill and put it into correct legal language. And so that's what I did, and that's what helped me so much. I had done so many favors along that line. There was hardly a senator when I ran for majority leader a few years later that I hadn't done some work for. And most of the times when I saw a defect in their bills, I would try to ask them if I could help without being one to put upon. And I managed to do it in a spirit of helping them. So in committees and in the Senate and everywhere else, I was rewriting practically half the legislation that went through, or maybe more.
And of course, that transcends partisanship.
Absolutely. What I did, just absolutely, it didn't make any difference. Many of the Republicans to this day ask me about it.
Or even factionalism within a...
That's right. And if I have someone that maybe I don't get along, I don't have close contact with in the Senate, still sometimes when they have a bill and they're having some trouble with it, they'll bring it to me, and I'll try to help them with it.
Okay. Since you mentioned the race for Senate Majority Leader, maybe we could get into that.
Sure.
And perhaps that will be the last thing we talk about today, because we
Right.
stayed over a little bit.
Well, that was an interesting situation. The first I knew about Senator Riley from Savannah not seeking re-election, he was the majority leader, was one morning I was in the Senate, and Tom Perdue, the governor's executive secretary, said he wanted to talk to me, so I went out into some office across the hall, and he says, Jack Riley is not going to run again, and therefore the majority leader's position is open. Said, we want you to support Frank Eldridge. And I said, well, what's the governor's role in this, Tom? Are you speaking for the governor, or are you speaking for yourself? He said, well, some of both. He says, the governor and Eldridge are close personal friends. Well, I had happened to have helped George Busby myself, and I just didn't believe George Busby was...
Was that the public utility bill, or?
No, this was when on the majority leader thing, but
Okay.
so
No,
Tom Perdue.
You would help George Busby yourself in this?
In his campaign for
Okay,
election,
right, okay.
when he first ran, which I believe was
74.
right in '74, I had supported him. I'd given him some money, and not a lot, and gone on record as helping him. But anyway, I told Perdue I'd think about it. Well, then a day or so later, I told him, I said, well, Tom, I think that some of our friends in the Senate have asked me to run for it. And he was very negative and pretty well threatened me, that I should not run, that he and the governor didn't look favorably on it. So I had someone ask the governor about it, and the governor said he was going to stay out of that race. He wasn't going to interfere in the Senate's business, and therefore, to do what I wanted to do. And it would not interfere with my relationships. But it did with Perdue. And Perdue had made me so angry by just asserting authority that he didn't have and interfering in internal Senate politics that I was determined to beat him. And so I proceeded to call on every senator in the state and tried to see them in their home districts. And I traveled the state all summer. And I had it won by a handy margin. And on the night before the election, the lieutenant governor, Zell Miller, he'll tell you this, weakened. Zell had stayed out of it and had guaranteed me he would stay out of it. But Eldridge had been a close personal friend. Eldridge had been in the Senate a long time, 16 or more years, and I'd been here 3. And they prevailed upon Zell to call a few senators and ask them to vote for Eldridge. Well, Zell changed 3 votes. I would have had 29 votes had Zell stayed out of it. And the other guy would have had 22. As it turned out, I got 26, and the other guy got 25. Zell and I never had any hard feelings about it. I could understand how, through the pressures that were put upon him by the Eldridge faction, they really called on him, for everything they had ever done for him, and so Zell sort of gave in. Well, since then, Zell and I worked very closely together.
Okay, so are you saying that as soon as you heard that the position was going to be vacant, that you began thinking about that yourself, or?
Well, I really hadn't thought about it. I knew that I wanted to do more in the Senate, but when I heard about it that morning, the first I heard about it really was from Tom Purdy, who called me to tell me that they wanted my support for the guy that eventually became my opponent. They didn't want any opposition. Well, when I went back in the Senate chamber, I mentioned it to Hugh Gillis and Joe Kennedy, and they said, "To hell with that. Purdy doesn't have any business interfering in our business, and furthermore, there are a lot of us here that we do not want Eldridge." And so Gillis and Kennedy and Starr said, "Look," and they were the leadership of the Senate even then. They said, "If you'll run, we'll support you." So it's going to be a bloody battle. And I said, "Well, you think I can win?" They said, "Yeah, you can win." And so that I had pretty well decided that day, after I talked to Purdy, but late in the afternoon. So the next day I told Purdy what I was going to do. Like I said, he didn't like it.
What was their reason for not liking Eldridge? Outside of any question of interference in the Senate.
Well, I think that for reasons that I never really understood, that Eldridge had been very abrupt with some of them and very, shall I say, I think the word probably would be overbearing. If he wanted to do something his way, he didn't consult with anybody. He was viewed by a lot of the senators being overbearing. And you need, as majority leader, one who is not overbearing. You must be able to get along with everyone, and you need to be able to consider all views. Then you need to make a decision in a way that is, they understand that although you can't agree with them on that particular issue, there's another day, because you do have to take sides. And if you try to say to all factions that, "Yeah, I'm gonna go with you," then everyone loses confidence in you. So they need to know where you stand, but they need to know it in a way that they can accept as you having made a decision in good conscience, without any personality, and based upon the best available information.
So Gillis, Starr, and Kennedy were among your main backers in that whole contest. And I know the votes had never been made public, but where was the opposition coming from, or where was the support for Eldridge coming from?
Well, the thing of it is that you had the president pro tem of the Senate at that time, Senator Al Holloway, who said he was going to vote for Eldridge. He even told me that, but said, "I won't do anything to hurt you." Well, that was, of course, he was a key player. He was a powerful player. Then you had the lieutenant governor, who said that he was going to stay out of it, and did until the later part. Had he gotten into it in the beginning, I probably would have lost. But by that time, I had 26 locked-in commitments that wouldn't change. I really had 29, but I lost 3 of them. Then you had pretty much all of the old guard, except some of the close Senate friends of Hugh Gillis. There was Senator McGill, Sam McGill, who recently passed, Senator Bill Fincher. Then I had some independents like Paul Brown from Athens. Then Steve Reynolds, who always went his own way, from up in Gwinnett County. So I had some really good people in there that had been in the Senate a long time. And their attitude, I think, their reason was that they could get along with me better than they could Eldridge.
What do you call it? It was at night or during the day that the actual vote was taken?
It was taken at about 10:15 in the morning, and It was, I knew, I just felt confident that I would win, but I was also aware that some, I just call it treachery, had gone on the night before, and I didn't know to what extent. I felt like three senators were wavering, and the fact of the matter is that they had switched sides. I would have been really concerned had I known that, but I felt like of the three, that not more than two would go, so I still had 2 votes. As it was, I lost all 3, so it was very close. But
so when that vote was announced, you were surprised by how?
well, Jimmy Lester, who was also one of the strong ones for me, was from Augusta.
Sure.
And Bill English from Swainsboro was for me. He was, from an adjoining district. Jimmy Lester nominated me, I believe, and in any event, he was one of the vote counters. One of the interesting things is that just last week before last, I nominated him for Highway Board, and I was the vote counter, or one of them, in his race. But in any event, Jimmy went up, and they didn't announce the vote as they were counting it on this occasion. They just, a representative of Eldridge was there, and Jimmy was there, and they counted those votes and looked through them, because it was just that one vote difference. And I wonder what in the heck has caused him so long. So Jimmy turned around, walked away from up there, and he sat right behind me in the stand. He leaned over and he said, "You won." I said, "Great." He says, "But by 1 vote." And so then the presiding officer, Linda Hill, announced the vote. And of course I was very pleased. But at the same time, the 1 vote margin, that's pretty close.
Can't get too much closer.
No. Well, I guess we better quit